Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the hackathon. We have a lot of activities still lined up for you. We know you're hard at work on your projects, so looking forward to supporting you in that way as well. But for a quick agenda on today's opening ceremony, there we go. We're going to start, as Mr. D said, with director's remarks, and then we have the keynote speaker, Dr. Wheeler, and a Q&A session. So if y'all have any questions during the presentation, just save them for the end. All right, schedule as always, you can scan this QR code for it. It's also very conveniently linked on our website. So just reference this if you have any questions about what's going on during the day. If you need any help during the event, you can email smathhacks@ncssm.edu for our online folks. And if you're residential, just feel free to find any director or organizer on campus. Actually, if leadership could just stand real quick so people know who you are. Yeah, so those are your go-to folks if you have any questions, concerns, comments as well. But yeah, y'all are good to go. Thank you. Okay. So you're going to learn a lot from this hackathon, hopefully gain some new skills, but there is also the chance to get some pretty cool awards. So just as a reminder, submission rules, they're due at 6 p.m. This is a hard deadline, and just honestly start preparing at 5 so you can have everything in at 6. The requirements are posted on DevPost, but just a reminder, 3-minute demo, explanation video, and then write-ups and links to all of your materials. And the feedback form will be posted at our closing ceremony today. This is mandatory for all participants to be given a certificate of completion, as well as considered for a raffle for our NVIDIA Shields, which are pretty neat, and we have 2 or more. So make sure to fill this out when we do post it later today. And of course, thank you to our sponsors for making this event possible. Y'all have been enjoying some pretty nice meals, a pretty nice venue. So please just be aware of all of these wonderful folks that have made it possible for you to be here today at no cost. All right, and now I am honored to welcome Dr. Andrew Wheeler. He is the Director of AI Engineering at Gainwell Technologies and founder of Crime Decoder. It's a crime analysis consulting service, and he holds a PhD in criminal justice from SUNY Albany and has over 10 years of experience developing operations research and predictive analytics for criminal justice agencies. A former crime analyst with Troy NY Police Department and professor of the University of Texas at Dallas, he has authored over 35 peer-reviewed publications, cited more than 1,000 times. And without further ado, please welcome Dr. Andrew Wheeler to the stage.
Thank you, Caroline, very much. I really appreciate all your time this morning. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Michael, and your opportunity, your invitation to come give you guys a talk this morning. And so I know it can seem like it's just a fun little event here, this hackathon, but the opportunity that you students have here at NCSSM, and I know that there's online students as well, I really consider you guys the future of the world. So anything big started out small, just like you're doing right now in this hackathon today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and you guys listen to me at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning for a little bit. When in Rome, I typically try to keep the math minimal when I'm giving talks, but so we're here at the NCSSM campus, and I figured a decent set of talks would be math hacks for life. And so Caroline already gave my introduction, so I won't belabor it any, but in a nutshell, I went to school for criminal justice. Most of my work was doing quantitative number crunching type applications with police departments. But one of the things with that, as well as you may think you go to school for a particular application. You may go to school for math or computer science or biology. Really, you'll ultimately be able to take those lessons from whatever those fields, and it's really all fundamentally based on math. And you will be able to apply those lessons to whatever particular application you want to. So even if you go to school for criminal justice, later on, you can go do work in biology. You could have a degree in physics and then go work for me in healthcare. Like, you'll be able to apply those lessons more broadly. You can see here, so although most of my work is in criminal justice, and I'll give a few examples, this little map on the right, that's a hotspot map of crime here in Durham. So I suppose if you take anything away from me, it's don't go to those purple areas here in Durham. But here you can see that little dot in the middle of the map. That's your school here. You're in a pretty safe area, so you don't have to worry about it too much. So day gig, I work in healthcare, identifying fraud, waste, and abuse in healthcare claims. But in addition to that, I still do consulting with police departments, and I write books too. So if you're interested in some of those, you can go check out those links. I know, based on my son goes here to NCSSM. And so most of the time, math professors often have a hard time articulating how that math can be practical for particular applications. And so a lot of times you hear students complain, like, why do I need to know derivative calculus? So what application does that have? And it's true that a lot of different fields, you do not need to know derivative calculus. If you're an accountant, you don't really need to know derivative calculus. I'm sure the professors here are better at identifying like how those applications are useful for students in those applied fields. But what I'm going to talk about today is a bunch of life lessons that I have personally taken from these different mathematical applications just over my life. And so they're definitely focused on statistics and operations research, since that's what the majority of my focus is. But you can apply math not just at your day gig, but how you live your life. And so I'm going to boil these down to several different lessons that come up repeatedly in my life over and over and over again. And they're not only useful for how you frame different problem solving, like you'll be doing here in this hackathon, but they're also useful for basically just how you frame different decision making in your life. And so lesson number one is, let me see if I can. It's cut off a little bit in the slides, but constraints always lower your objective function. And so I know it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I'll try to keep the math a little bit minimal, but imagine you just have a function y equals a plus b, and you're trying to maximize y. You can have an unconstrained function that a and b could be whatever they want to be. And so in that scenario, y is basically unbounded. In real life, we're almost always working with constraints. So imagine A or B are investments that you can make into different funds. A constraint in that scenario is just how much money you potentially have to invest. Imagine A or B are time spent doing something you want to do, playing video games versus sleeping. Time's zero sum. You basically can't infinitely spend all your time in A playing video games and still get the amount of sleep that you need B. So there's fundamental constraints in those particular systems. And the lesson broadly is that the unconstrained equation always has a lower objective. The unconstrained equation always has a potentially higher objective function than the constrained equation. This map on the right, I did work with analyzing death rates following shootings in Philadelphia. So when individuals were hit with gunshots. What this map shows, the X's are locations of level 1 trauma centers in Philadelphia. And then the map shows the gradient of the probability of death for individuals shot by gun wounds. And so in that scenario, most of the people when they're shot, well, I should rephrase that. Most people when they're actually shot, they don't die. So the probability of death is between typically 20% to 30%. But the people who do die, most of the time that they die, it's not based on being hit in a vital organ. It's based on blood loss. So most of the time, when people die post gunshot wounds, it's due to that blood loss. And contrary to some expectations, these fatality rates have been going up over time. So even though that there's been medical interventions that have improved caring for these individuals, over the past 20 so years, it's really gone, those fatality rates have gone from like 10, 15%, that they're closer to 30% across the US. A show of hands here, folks who are familiar with this particular meme. We got a couple in the room. Okay. I was your guys' age when this particular commercial came out. And so what this commercial is it's for tacos. It's an El Paso commercial. And so this little girl's family is arguing whether they should buy hard shell or soft shell tacos. And then the little girl in the commercial just says, "Why don't we have both?" A lot of times when you're thinking about particular problems, the way that you should think about solutions to those problems aren't necessarily changing the objective function. It's to think about the fundamental constraints that individuals are posing to you for those questions. And so for the little girl in the old El Paso, instead of forcing everyone, like I gave my example of choosing between two options, choosing between playing video games versus choosing to go to sleep, in that scenario, somebody was making a false dichotomy, forcing everyone to choose either A or B. The solution to improve the utility for that particular equation is to just give people choice. Let people choose the soft shell or let people choose the hard shell tacos. Now, that's a silly example, but there's all sorts of those false dichotomies in life. And in particular, if you hear somebody say, "We have always done this way," that's almost always like a false constraint that somebody's imposed on that particular system. And now with the gunshot wound examples, our fundamental issue is time. And I showed that if you're further away from a level 1 trauma center, you really can't, you can only travel on streets so fast. And so, simultaneously, you can't really pop up a level 1 trauma center in different parts of the city. So if I went back to the map, basically North Philadelphia, there was a larger purple area. It's not feasible to go just open a level 1 trauma center wherever you want in the city. It is feasible, though, to change the dynamic. So traditionally, what would happen is somebody would get shot, somebody would call 911, officers would go to the scene. Now, a fundamental aspect of most urban areas is that there's way more police officers than there are EMTs. And so police officers typically have much faster response rates. One of the things Philadelphia did in response to this is instead of waiting for the EMT to come and then transport the victim to the hospital, officers in Philadelphia actually have the option to do what's called scoop and run. They can literally put the person in the back of their patrol vehicle and take them to the emergency room. And so that's changing the constraint. So they're not changing how fast you can travel on the road, but they are changing how fast that you can respond to the incident. Other examples I'm familiar with, I didn't do this work, but one of my friends basically worked on dynamic routing of the EMT units. So like I said, there's much fewer ambulances in cities typically than police departments. His name is George Moeller. What George did was basically dynamically situate where the ambulances sat. So instead of an ambulance sitting in a centralized location, If one ambulance goes out, he may redistribute them, have them go sit in a parking lot of a Dunkin' Donuts. So they're at a location where they're predicted to be faster getting to the response of the event. And he did that for heroin or opioid overdoses in Indianapolis. And the last example I give, folks in Pittsburgh, like I said, most individuals who die subsequent a gunshot wound die from blood loss. And so what the individual in Pittsburgh is doing is basically optimizing the locations of blood banks. So instead of having someone have to go to the level 1 trauma center to receive blood, he has blood banks stored around Pittsburgh so it can be faster for an individual to get that blood to save their life. Again, it's not, you have fundamental constraints for everything that you have in life, but oftentimes thinking about how we can get around those, how we can lower those constraints is the way to improve that objective function. Now, given what my son says about the physics professors here, I would not use my mathematical notation in any of your courses. And so here, what the argument is saying is utility is the maximum of f of x, where x is an element of reals. And so by reals here, I do not mean all real potential numbers. I mean reals is in real options that you can choose to maximize your personal utility. You may be wondering who this powdered wig fellow is on the right. He is not a mathematician. He's just a popular Enlightenment writer named Voltaire, or his pen name was Voltaire. And so a quote that's attributed to him, but was no doubt, many people have said it over the years, is the idea of don't let the perfect be the element of the good. In the prior example I gave, we basically only had one potential input. You had the distance, you had the time between when an individual got shot and when they received a blood transfusion. And so most utility functions that we have in life tend to be much more complicated and much more difficult to evaluate. If you're thinking about what college to go to, there's effectively an infinite number of potential variables that you can consider. If you're thinking about a job, or if you're thinking about what to do for a hackathon, basically the universe of potential things that you can evaluate, the number of real decisions is infinite. The lesson here is that you don't need to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And you can only evaluate a subset of those potential inputs. So you can't really ever get the argmax of fx in this scenario. The idea, you can't ever get the perfect, but you can get the good. And so there are many situations, or I should say almost all situations in life, that have those complicated inputs, and to evaluate that function of f is very difficult. But you should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The rule of thumb here I give to evaluate 3, that's from another popular problem called the secretary stopping problem. And so oftentimes, if you just evaluate a few different scenarios and then choose the best amongst those, yes, it's not going to be the optimal, but there's almost always diminishing returns. And so often just picking a few and seeing out which works best for you, evaluating that complicated function is sufficient for you to make a good decision, even if it's not the perfect decision. Now, the next life lesson is the idea of parallel versus sequential. And so I know all of you were up late last night working on your particular project. And so even though the hackathon is somewhat artificially constrained. You only have 2 days to work on your particular application. Basically, everything in life has some of those fundamental time constraints that you're working on. I could go to my boss today and say, I think I could build this thing to make us $20 million, but it's going to take me 5 years. And he would tell me no, because 5 years is too long. So even though 2 days is pretty short, in reality, I have to work with constraints on months or quarters, because I work for a big old company, but still I'm expected to do stuff, be able to show results on a regular basis. And so not just for work, but basically any big project in your life, you can think of it as a big task, but ultimately you can always turn that big task into a set of smaller subtasks. And so sequential processing is the idea that you do subtask 1 and then subtask 2 and then subtask 3. In computer science, there's this idea of embarrassingly parallel algorithms. And so some things you can break up into those subtasks, do them independently, and then basically have other little mini computers run those tasks and aggregate them up. So if you're calculating the mean of a big set of data, you can turn it into tiny sets of data, have individual computers compute that mean, and then subsequently aggregate them back up. And so that's the idea of running things in parallel. It's an important concept to be able, if you can break your algorithm into an embarrassingly parallel algorithm, you can basically run it as fast as you can, depending on how many machines that you can split it amongst. Now, if we're talking about real life tasks, or even for the example, like hypothetical examples of like having computers all do a bunch of mini tasks, there's often coordination between those computers. And so in real life, your tasks are not embarrassingly parallel. And so you have to consider, when can I do task 1? What is sequential? So like, what do you need to do first versus what can other individuals help you with? And so this is not only something that you're probably dealing with your teams here in this hackathon now. How do I divvy up tasks? But also, what do I need to do first versus what do I need to do second? And so that's just a fundamental aspect of planning out your life. Some things are sequential, things that you can do parallel, things that you can have friends help you with, can make you accomplish those big tasks much faster. But there's always that coordination overhead for those, like how you divvy up those tasks and how you ask individuals for help and then aggregate those results back in the end. Now, I actually only have a few different equations memorized, and this is one of them, the linearity of expectations. If you haven't been introduced to this bold E, the bold E there is the expected value. And you can just think of the expected value as like the hypothetical parameter corresponding to the mean of a distribution. So if we have y1 and the expected value of y1 and the expected value of y2, if you sum y1 and y2, the expected value is linear. And so if y1 is the number of hard shell tacos I eat in a year, say 50 on average, and y2 is the number of soft shell tacos I eat in a year, say 100. If I ask what's the expected number of total tacos Andy eats in a year, would be 150. Why I think that this is useful for a life lesson is the idea that there's things in life that you're going to have to do repeatedly over and over and over again to be subsequently successful. And so here, if we call PI as the probability of success for any particular event, there are many things you're going to do in life that have a low probability. you guys are a little young to be worrying about the job market now. But when you do go onto the job market, if it's similar then how it is now, the probability when you apply to any particular job is quite low. It may only be 1%, it may be less than 1%. But what increases your potential chances is basically applying to more and more jobs. So oftentimes when people talk about probabilities and combinatorics, there's a little bit more complicated equation to figure out the probability of success for one. That's almost never the one that you're interested in. You're almost always interested in like improving the expected number of potential events. And so based on the linearity of expectations, if PI is your probability of success of getting a job interview and it's 1%, if you apply to 100 jobs, you're likely to have at least one potential interview. Now, one of the other parts of this is there's some things where that PI is low, but you could potentially improve. So if you're thinking about applying to colleges, you probably are not going to apply to 100 different colleges. It's definitely worth your time to basically improve your application materials to bump that probability up. So to go from a 5% probability to 20% probability by having a nicer essay, essentially. So there's some scenarios where it's worth spending that extra time to increase that probability. But there's a lot of scenarios in life. Like I said, the job applying scenario, there's honestly not that much that you can do. So spending hours on crafting a cover letter is not going to increase that probability all that much. And so in that scenario, your best bet to increase the number of interviews you get is to just apply some more. And so breaking that down, knowing that your probability is low and then that you have to try over and over and over again is an important concept. So both how you increase your expected number of successful events, as well as knowing that, okay, going in, this is a small probability. I should basically know that I'm going to have to try multiple times before I'm successful. Now, the next example I'm showing here is basically the flip side of that. If you can try over and over and over again till you're successful, somebody else can use that same basic tenet to basically do experiments over and over and over again until they are potentially successful. And this is a pretty simple example here of an XKCD comet. Basically doing experiments until they find that green jelly beans are linked to acne. And so, although this is a particular silly example, here's another aquatic, at least mildly aquatic related example that somebody actually did. And so what you can see here on the screen is an MRI result of a dead salmon. And so the way that MRI machines work, it's an instrument like anything else that measures the electrical activity in the brain. And so those instruments aren't perfect. And so there's essentially statistical algorithms that go on behind the hood to try to identify that electrical activity that's going on for the MRI machine. This particular paper, what the authors did is they put a dead salmon through the MRI. I forget exactly how long it was dead, if it was a few hours or a few days. But that dead salmon still resulted in some electrical activity. They're called voxels, and they're not pixels, they're cubes, essentially. And so If you try over and over and over again, in the example with the MRI, you basically have a bunch of little cells in the brain that individuals are trying to measure. And so if they apply that instrumentation over and over and over again, it will result in false positives after a while. And so the life lesson in that is basically the flip side of the linearity of expectation that I was telling you about before. If all you do is just monitor what other individuals are doing without seeing the failures, anybody can make something seem successful. Anybody can sell you a dead fish has some brain activity if you don't see the failures. And so if you go online, if you go onto whatever social media folks kids are using these days, you may just see successes. You're probably not going to see those hundreds of failures that came before it. And so that's important to know, to like understand how people got to where they're at, as well as understand that there's a lot of snake oil salesmen that can try to sell you a dead fish that has brain activity. The next example I'm going to talk about is this idea behind precision and recall. So I just talked about those voxels that lit up on the dead fish. Those were false positives. And so no matter, basically most instruments that you're dealing with are not perfect. They're not foolproof. Almost everything has a certain level of error. And that's not only true for the fMRI machines, it's basically true of almost any instrument that we're using. This next lesson is we need to think about the types of errors for that particular application. And so for basically every application, you have this fundamental trade-off between precision and recall. And so precision is the probability of the outcome conditional on you make a prediction of that outcome. Recall is basically the amount of the outcome that you capture with your predictive instrument. So they're basically flipping the conditional for those two. I think it's actually, as opposed to viewing it like this, I think it's easier to view it in this decision tree. I don't really have any examples of working oceanic in my career, but one example I do have for a data competition. NASA and NOAA wanted folks to build predictive models to identify algae blooms based on satellite imagery. So let's just pretend we're predicting algae blooms based on inland bodies of water in the US. So say we have like 1,000 individual ponds. 50 of those ponds in this example had algae blooms, and 950 did not. And this instrument has a 90% what they would call sensitivity, but it's basically, we captured 45 out of the 50. But because those algae blooms are pretty rare, we have a 10% false positive rate. So we have 95 false positives out of those 950 that did not end up having algae blooms. In this example, even though our sensitivity is what they would call this is 90%, and our false positive rate is only 10%. Our precision of our estimate, another way to call it is positive predictive value, in this scenario is still only 30%. So even though offhand it seems like, oh gosh, we have a fairly sensitive instrument, 90%, and the false positive rates are pretty low, 10%. When we actually predict a pond has algae blooms, it's still only 30% in this particular scenario. Ultimately, balancing that precision versus recall it's important to it basically it matters what you're doing with that particular information. And so even though I won that competition predicting algae blooms, honestly, my model was basically worthless. So it ended up being like states in the Western US tended to have more frequent algae blooms. And so the model wasn't much more than saying, well, the satellite image is a little bit more greener and it's in the Western US. And that model was sufficient to win that competition. And NASA or NOAA didn't have really particular plans with what they were going to do with those algae blooms. Most of the time for the algae blooms, it's just based on runoff from farmland. And so the solution may have not even been a predictive model at all. It may have been some other mechanism to basically present runoff from fertilizer to those locations. And so knowing what the pond, whether the pond already had an algae bloom in it, really wasn't that helpful. You need to think about what you're actually going to do with that subsequent information. This graph I show here is another piece of work that I've done with police departments and creating predictive algorithms to identify individuals who are likely to be involved with future violence. And so this is just from one of my papers. And so this is predicting whether an individual is likely to be shot or shoot someone. And so this work is being shot or shooting someone is very rare. Basically, folks in this room have somewhere on the magnitude of 1 in 100,000 to maybe 1 in a million of being the victims of gun violence. And so what happens both, I showed hotspots of crime earlier in the talk. There's also a very small number of individuals who are likely involved that tend to be involved with gun violence. And so you can predict those individuals. So the individuals who are at high risk here, like I said, the folks in the room are more like 1 in 100,000, if not much lower. These folks are more like 1 in 1,000. And so that's 1,000-fold increase. It ends up being more like 4,000 or 5,000-fold increase. But even amongst them, the probability that they're actually going to be involved in gun violence is pretty rare. And so what this means is that if I take my top 1,000 individuals in this city, it only ends up being, for the best predictive model, 40 of them are subsequently involved in gun violence. The risk is crazy high relative to the baseline population, but I'm still, if I went and just did a minority report situation and it basically harassed these individuals, almost all of them are false positives. So even though the model is about as good as it can get, almost all of it's false positives. But if your intervention, you have to think about what the intervention is in that scenario. You have to weigh those trade-offs with false positives and false negatives. And so what a lot of police departments do in this scenario isn't minority report. It's basically these softer interventions. This particular city, all that they did was they assigned individuals a caseworker. So they had somebody go out and essentially have the caseworker go and help individuals get a driver's license or get a job. And so even though a lot of people have that like negative perception of predictive algorithms, it's totally what you do with the algorithm that matters. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a harsh criminal in that scenario. It could be a pro-social intervention. But ultimately, for any particular application, you should not only know those particular errors, but know the trade-off. Know whether you're trying to maximize this recall. So if we're talking about terrorist events, basically you want to maximize recall. You want to basically prevent any of those catastrophic events. But in other scenarios where it can infringe on people's liberties, we really want precision. Like we don't want to make a prediction and then have very many false positives. We almost always want it to be true if we make that prediction. So the next example I'm going to give is from probably most of you have been introduced in your intro stats class about the normal distribution. But I almost never use the normal distribution for any of my work directly. What's more common is the Poisson distribution. And so Poisson is not a French fish in this scenario. It's a French mathematician who derived the original probability mass function for the Poisson distribution. And the Poisson distribution is used to basically count events over time. And so the fundamental assumption of the Poisson distribution is if the inter-arrival time of events is random. And what that basically just means is that one event doesn't precipitate another event. So in this scenario, if one shark attack doesn't cause other sharks to go attack more people, that counting process is likely to follow a Poisson distribution. And so even if you just have those two numbers, if you know on average you have 0.6 shark attacks a month, you can know whether that 2 shark attacks in a month is weird or is an outlier or is likely what is expected by chance. And so the applications that I apply this in my prior work are basically helping crime analysts identify when crime's going up or down. So it's easy to look at crime reports and be like, oh, it seems like we have a trend. It seems like there's more crime happening this week than there was last week. You can use the Poisson distribution to basically identify whether there's those anomalies over time or not. Another example is basically using predictive models to identify officer misbehavior. And so one of these, you can identify if officers are basically using force more often than they should be based on the average number of events overall for the police department. The life lesson in this, though, is I talked about the linearity of expectation before, so the expected value of the distribution. The life lesson here is really just about the variance, though. And so, this is basically, if you don't have the mean, one of the metrics that I mean, a lot of times people, when they talk about the Poisson distribution, they'll talk about how the mean is equal to its variance. So if you have a mean of 100, that means the variance of that distribution is 100 as well. So if you have something that happens around, a count of something that happens around 100 times a month, the variance is 100. The square root of that is the standard deviation. And so plus or minus 2 standard deviations is what we would say is typical of variation there. So if you have something that happens 100 times a month and there's a month with 120 or a month with 80, that's still within the typical range that you would expect. This other formula works well for small count numbers. So basically if you just have 2 numbers. So if you have 5 in a month, or let's go easier numbers. If you have 9 in a month versus 16 in a month. So the square root of 9 is 3. And then the square root of 16 is 4. So it would be -1. 2 times -1 is -2. And so that transformation is approximately normally distributed. And so it's just an easy way in your head to like know if something's like going up or down, whether it's basically in line with the typical Poisson distribution or if stuff is changing over time. The life lesson here is really just about variance. And so there's going to be stuff that happens. So your instrument may randomly fail. You may get into a car accident tomorrow. You may fail a test. There'll be things that happen in your life, and they'll be random. And so it's important to understand the distinction between what's that a random event chasing the noise. And so the idea behind chasing the noise is that you don't want to rearrange your life because there's this random event that happened that occurred. We shouldn't boil the ocean because there were 2 shark attacks in a month. And you shouldn't rearrange your life if there's these random events that happen. It's important to know that there's variance in things that will happen to you in life. Now, this last equation that I have up, this is Andy Wheeler's equation, essentially. And so what I call this here is the utility at time t is always greater than or equal to the utility at time t minus 1. And so I call this most things suck. And what that means is that if you look back into the past, when I was your guys' age, I worked on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania. We used AOL chat rooms in MySpace. So Facebook just started when I was in college. We used to have to do this random, we had dial-up internet. And so you used to have to listen to this totally every time you logged on to the internet. Even with just within the past few years, I think one of the fundamental differences between what you guys are experiencing now versus individuals my age and even older individuals is that the pace of change is much more rapid in the world now. Basically, everybody has a smartphone now. The smartphone is much more powerful than any computer I had by a wide margin when I was your guys' age. It was even more powerful than any computer I had back around 15 years ago. You essentially have the world at your fingertips now. There's all sorts of things about AI coming out now as well. And so the world is rapidly changing, and it's changing to be better. So most things suck now, but you can basically make them better. And so there isn't going to be sometimes, especially with the AI stuff, people talk about like there's AI is going to take everybody's jobs or things like that. That's based on a fundamental, to me, an error that says that there's a finite amount of work. And so basically, if you can build something, if I need to do 10 things today, and so somebody built a bot, whether it's myself or somebody else, to go do those 10 things, it's not like I'm going to go take a vacation. I'm going to find 10 more things to do. There's essentially an infinite number of things you guys can improve in life. Things get better from the effort that you put into them, not only in this hackathon, but when you guys go to school, when you guys go to colleges, when you guys start your own businesses, when you work for these other big companies as well. It's you folks in the room right now that will make these things better. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate your time this morning.